Well, hello and welcome back. My name is Ripley Atkinson. I'm the Australian Livestock and Commodities Manager for StoneX based in Sydney, Australia, where we're developing price risk management tools for the Australian beef industry to help the sector manage market and price volatility with our Australian feeder cattle swap. Today, in the Australian cattle and beef markets, I'm going to examine how weather conditions and seasonal conditions impact grass fed beef production here in Australia. But before I do, I want to provide some context to this situation and why Australia operates the way it does, in the sense of it's very much a grass fed dominated system. So it's quite the opposite to America. In Australia, about on average 60 to 65% of total beef production is grass fed, whereas our grain fed system is only accounting for about 35% over the last 25 years. So it gives you a bit of an idea that naturally, as a country, we're much more grass fed dominated, but the reason being is because of the vast, extensive nature of our production system. Australia operates at scale in its beef production farming enterprises, and for that reason, we see a lot more grass fed stock produced naturally because of the distance it takes to access stock, the distance for stock to travel, and simply the nature of being able to handle livestock, particularly in Northern Australia, only really happens sometimes once a year, generally twice a year. And because of that, you don't see a lot of stock then moved through the system or handled often, which means they stay on farm and then move off farm and be processed. When we look at a historical level and consider how Australia's operated over the last 50 years in terms of our production system and whether we produce more grass or grain fed beef, traditionally we've been recognised, as I say, as a very predominant grass fed system, particularly up until 2015. So Australia's beef producers and their sow cattle, that was always targeted as a market as what we call a grass fed bullock. And that was an animal that spent 100% of its life on grass and would remain on grass until it was processed. This was particularly the case for basically Australia's period and history here in the country since settlement up until 2015. But from 2013 to 15, Australia went through a fairly widespread, substantial drought, and that period was a real period of transformation for the beef supply chain. What I mean by that was that period of 2 years of drought really encouraged a change of enterprise or end or target market for the Australian beef industry. So, for some statistics, between or since then, grass fed steer production or grass fed steer slaughter in Australia at a quarterly average has fallen nearly 50% or over 233,000 head per quarter compared to the preceding 15-year average. So it gives you an idea, a drop of 50% on the period since 2015 is fairly substantial. And what happened there was the producers chose to move away from that grass-fed system to protect themselves against the potential dry conditions impacting their business and their capacity to offload stock. Another way or another statistic to look at it, the feedlot system during this period saw substantial growth. And following that, we've seen a real increase in the number of cattle that go through Australia's feedlots. For example, there's been a 16% rise in grass-fed cattle turn-off or slaughter since 2015 in that drought period. And conversely, there's been a 21% decline or the same in actual numbers, 1.3 million head decline in grass-fed slaughter since. It gives you an idea about that period of 2013 to 15 and how transformational it was for Australian beef producers to turn their focus to the feedlot sector and move away from the grass-fed production system. But we bring ourselves now to current day, and that backstory provides a bit of context of where we are at the minute. And I think it's important to recognize that this is a liquid fluid situation. It does fluctuate and change. And what underpins it really, and I've just mentioned that about that historical period of 13 to 15, is seasonal conditions. And they're the major underpinning factor or determinant of the volume of grass fed cattle Australia processes and subsequently how that relationship moves. So it's actually quite inverse in the sense that when you have dry seasonal conditions like we've had in 2015, 2019, and 2023, what you see there is grass-fed cattle supply or cattle slaughter increases, and there's an uptick. And the reason for that is producers turn cattle off because there's a lack of available grass for stock to graze. It naturally makes sense. So there's a lack of rain, grass doesn't grow, producers then move those stock on. But when you see that flip and seasonal conditions are average to above average or they're wet for the Australian beef producers, grain fed cattle supply increases because producers choose to retain stock on farm. So grass fed supply decreases. It's an inverse relationship to the seasonal conditions you're experiencing at the time. Now, looking ahead, next year in large parts of Eastern Australia, there is the forecast for a broader drying trend of weather to move into the eastern states. Now, if this were to eventuate, we could expect a higher turnoff of grass fed stock in 2026. As I mentioned, the 2019 and 2023 periods where we saw an increase in grass fed supply, what that did, particularly the 2023 period where Australian cattle prices crashed anywhere from 60 to 80% in the space of 4 or 5 months, it really pushed producers to turn stock off faster. And traditionally, what you see there is more grass fed stock are processed because they're sent straight away to market rather than going through the feedlot system. The only differential now moving forwards, particularly when we're considering next year and the volume of grass fed beef Australia is going to produce, is the fact that feedlots in Australia over the last 5 years have grown nearly by 60% or 600,000 head. That's the number of cattle on feed increase we've seen in Australia over the past 5 years 60%, 600,000 head more than 5 years ago. When we consider that, I think the matter to remember in 2026 is the fact of that feedlot expansion. And as a result of that, we could see the spike in grass-fed production be a little lower than what we've seen in previous market cycles because of the increase in feedlot capacity or feedlot space. That's all for this week. For more content like this, make sure you head to Apple or Spotify and search for the Australian Cattle and Beef Market Report. This is our fortnightly podcast released on every second Friday, Australian time. And that's where I jump into discussion points like this one. We consider price, supply, demand, exports, and other factors that influence the Australian beef market. Make sure to subscribe to that podcast or this episode and feel free to give us a review. It helps others find us. But until next time, take care. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you then.